Hello, if you can hear this, if this recorder still works and someone someday finds it. My name is Kenji. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, though I suppose that title, doctor, means very little now. Less than nothing. I was a botanist. My specialty was controlled environment agriculture, hydroponics, aeroponics, vertical farming. My life's work was to perfect the art of growing food without soil, without seasons, without the messy, unpredictable whims of nature. I built gardens in sterile boxes. There's an irony in that I can't quite escape. How I tried to build a world independent of nature, only to be cast out into its ruins when it finally broke. I'm recording this for the same reason people once carved figures on cave walls, to say we were here and this is what happened. History should be more than just silent ruins and scattered bones. Someone has to tell the story. And it didn't happen with a bomb. It didn't happen with a plague that targeted us. It began with a sound that vanished. It happened with a silence, a profound, vegetative, and patient silence. It was always going to be the bees. We had the data for decades: colony collapse disorder, neonicotinoid pesticides, habitat loss. We saw it all as a slow decline, a problem for the next generation. We were wrong. It wasn't a decline, it was a cliff. The agent of the apocalypse, as we pieced it together from the frantic last days of global data sharing, was a pathogen. We called it Apis mortem, the bee death. We believe it was a chimera, a horrifyingly elegant piece of bioengineering, though whether it was accidental or intentional is a question for the philosophers of a dead civilization. It had the fast-acting neurotoxicity of the deadliest pesticides, capable of killing a bee in minutes. But it was fused with the reproductive mechanism of a cordyceps-like fungus. The genius of it, the absolute cruelty, was that the toxicity was delayed just long enough. The infected bee, its nervous system already failing, would be driven by its last confused instinct to return to the hive. Once inside, the fungus would complete its life cycle, erupting from the bee's body and releasing a cloud of microscopic spores. The hive, a marvel of social engineering, became a self-contained contamination chamber. Within 48 hours, the colony would be a tomb of infectious dust. It did not stop with honeybees. The pathogen was a generalist, a masterpiece of lethal design. It jumped to bumblebees, to solitary bees, to mason bees. It had an affinity for the entire Hymenoptera order. Then it mutated. Or perhaps it was designed with a secondary infection vector. It began to infect hoverflies, moths, butterflies, even the clumsy beetles that blunder their way from flower to flower, carrying pollen on their legs by accident. Within a single growing season, nearly 80% of the world's terrestrial pollinating insects were functionally extinct. The knock-on effects were immediate and catastrophic. The bats that pollinated the agave and the saguaro in the deserts of the Americas starved. The hummingbirds, with their hummingbird-fast metabolisms, vanished when the flowers they depended on ceased to offer nectar. The world didn't scream. It held its breath, and it feasted. The last harvest, the one just before the first silent spring, was unnaturally bountiful. With fewer insects to damage the crops, the fruits were perfect, unblemished. Supermarket shelves were overflowing with flawless apples, pears, and plums. The news ran stories about a miracle harvest. I watched the reports from my lab, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. They didn't understand. This wasn't a feast. It was the planet's lavish, beautiful, final supper. Then came the spring, and the silence. I lived in a rural area, near a large commercial apple orchard. Every spring of my life, the air had thrummed with a sound so constant you forgot it was there. The collective, industrious buzz of tens of thousands of bees. That year, there was nothing, just the wind and the new leaves. The apple trees bloomed in a defiant, glorious riot of white and pink. It was the most beautiful, tragic spectacle I had ever witnessed. They were offering a feast to a world of dead guests. and no fruit came. The blossoms, unvisited, withered and fell, carpeting the ground in a shroud of failure. It was the same story everywhere. Almond groves in California, melon fields in Spain, coffee plantations in Colombia, a green death, a world full of leaves and stems and roots, but no fruit, no seeds, no future. My facility, Eden Biologics, was supposed to be the Ark, a closed-loop system, a monument to human ingenuity. We grew everything, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, strawberries, in pristine white towers under the perfect calibrated glow of LED lights. But we had a vulnerability, a single point of failure I had argued about for years in budget meetings. For our fruiting plants, wind and mechanical vibration aren't enough for optimal pollination. You need what's called sonication, or buzz pollination. You need the specific resonant frequency of a bee's wing muscles vibrating to shake the pollen from the flower's anthers. And for that, we relied on commercially bred bumblebees, shipped to us in climate-controlled boxes. The last shipment arrived in May. I remember opening the box in our quarantine lab. They were all dead. A neat, still pile of black and yellow fur. I didn't need to run a test. I knew Apis mortem had come for us. I walked through the sterile white halls of our facility, past the silent leafy towers of fruitless plants, and I knew it was over. Our perfect sealed box was just a bigger, more expensive tomb. Society held on for a few more months, running on the fumes of the last harvest. First, the canned goods vanished, then pasta, rice, flour, the dry goods. The government made announcements, rationing, emergency measures, task forces. But how do you ration a harvest that will never come again? The chaos was quiet at first. Long lines, empty shelves. Then it grew louder. Riots over a truckload of potatoes, fights over a sack of flour. I didn't wait for the final collapse. I saw the cascading failure in the math. I spent a week in my lab, not eating, not sleeping. I was compiling a library, my own Ark. Inside a heavily modified, climate-controlled, shock-proof Pelican case, I gathered my life's real work. Not the research papers or the accolades, but the things themselves. The seeds. But not just any seeds. I gathered every variety of self-pollinating and wind-pollinating plant I had access to. Heirloom strains of peas and beans that can fertilize themselves with their flowers still closed. Specific cultivars of tomatoes that can set fruit with simple wind agitation. And grains. I took so many grains: wheat, barley, oats, rye, corn. The grasses that feed the world, pollinated not by an insect's wing, but by the careless breath of the wind. They were our only hope. The day I left, I took one last walk through the facility. The backup generators were failing. The perfect LED lights flickered and died, casting the towers of fruitless plants in an eerie twilight. It was a monument to our spectacular arrogance. A multi-billion-dollar facility, defeated by the absence of a creature the size of my thumb. I strapped the seed case to my back. It was heavy, a physical burden of hope. My goal was simple, logical, and clinically insane. I had to get from the dying heart of North America to the northernmost point of Norway. I had to get to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the Doomsday Vault, the last library on Earth. I stepped outside into the sunlight. The world looked beautiful, green, lush, and vibrantly alive. But it was a lie, a beautiful, deadly lie. I could feel the silence, a silence that was patiently eating the world, one blossom at a time. And I started walking north. The world I stepped into was a masterpiece of deception. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you wouldn't have seen the apocalypse. The grass was green, greener than ever, with no insects to graze on it. The trees were full and leafy, but it was a painted-over death, an uncanny valley of ecology. I'd walk for hours through dense forests and see no berries on the bushes, no acorns on the oaks. I'd pass backyard gardens where lush, sprawling squash vines grew with vigorous life, their beautiful yellow flowers opening like trumpets to a silent sky, waiting for a visitor who would never come, and then withering and falling to the ground, one by one. The animals knew. Their world had unraveled first. The songbirds that fed on insects and berries were gone. The squirrels and chipmunks were thin and pathologically aggressive, fighting over the last of the previous year's nuts. The silence of the insects was followed by the silence of the birds, and the world grew quieter and emptier with each passing day. The first few weeks of the collapse were a study in human denial. People stayed in their homes, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of screens, waiting for the government to fix it. The news anchors, with dwindling reserves of makeup and hairspray, broadcast promises of solutions. Fleets of pollinating drones, genetically modified, self-fertilizing fruit trees. These were fever dreams, the technological fantasies of a species that had forgotten it was part of a biological system. You can't 3D print an ecosystem. You can't write a software patch for 1 billion years of evolution. The scale of the problem was too immense, too fundamental. The partnership was broken. The real currency of the new world wasn't money or gold. It was calories and information. Specifically, the knowledge of what was still edible. The government's final desperate act before it dissolved into silence was to broadcast lists of edible wild plants. It was a well-intentioned catastrophe. People who couldn't tell the difference between wild carrot and poison hemlock died in agony. Entire families were poisoned by mushrooms they'd mistaken for meadow sweets, their bodies discovered weeks later by neighbors who were themselves on the brink. The natural world, which they had ignored for so long, had become a minefield of their own ignorance. I saw the change in people from a distance. At first it was fear, a frantic energy. Then it settled into a hard, cold pragmatism that was far more terrifying. I watched a man from a hilltop one afternoon. He was methodically stripping the bark from a line of young willow trees. He was harvesting the cambium, the thin, slimy inner layer of bark. It's edible, but just barely. It's mostly cellulose, but it contains just enough sugar to keep a human body from shutting down. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't crying, he was working, methodical, efficient. That was more frightening than any riot. It was the look of acceptance, the look of a species learning to graze. My seed case was my secret, my burden, my one fragile hope. I wrapped it in old burlap sacks, made it look like a worthless bundle of rags. If anyone knew what I was carrying, a compact, refrigerated library of the world's future food, I would be dead in minutes. So I became a ghost. I skirted the towns, I moved at dawn and dusk. I learned to read the landscape not for its beauty, but for its threats and its resources. A plume of smoke meant a camp, and a camp meant desperate people. A well-maintained house with smoke coming from the chimney meant it was defended, and its owners were likely paranoid and trigger-happy. The derelict homes were the safest for shelter, but you always had to be careful. The dead, in those early days, were often still in their homes, silent casualties of hunger or poisoned foraging. My goal, Svalbard, seemed like a fever dream in the daylight, an impossibility born of desperation. But at night, whispering into this recorder, I would reinforce the logic of it, convincing myself again and again. The Svalbard Vault is a masterpiece of engineering and foresight. It's built deep inside a sandstone mountain in the Norwegian archipelago, far above sea level, safe from any conceivable tsunami. The permafrost that surrounds it is a natural freezer, keeping the seeds viable for centuries even if the power fails completely. It's designed to withstand earthquakes, nuclear strikes, and the slow, patient ravages of time. It holds duplicates of seed collections from gene banks all around the globe, the seeds of our entire agricultural civilization. It was built for this exact moment, not for a sudden, fiery apocalypse, but for a slow, quiet, biological unraveling. I needed to get to the coast. The highways were death-trap corridors, clogged with stalled vehicles and ambush points. I traveled through the forgotten parts of the country, the arteries of a bygone era. Old railway lines, their iron rails rusting away, overgrown service roads for power lines that no longer carried power, dry creek beds that cut through the landscape like secret pathways. I learned to see the world through a new set of eyes. My botanist's knowledge, once an academic pursuit, was now my shield and my sustenance. I knew that the starchy, tuberous roots of the common cattail, when roasted, were as nourishing as potatoes. I knew that the bitter green leaves of the dandelion were packed with vitamins. I knew that acorns, a food source ignored for centuries, could be leached of their bitter tannins in running water to make a crude protein-rich flour. I was surviving on the weeds of our old civilization, the stubborn, resilient plants that nobody wanted, the ones that didn't need a bee to grant them life. One evening, I took shelter in an abandoned school bus, rusting in a field. The seats were torn out, and the floor was littered with the detritus of a brief, failed camp. I found a child's science textbook, its pages swollen with moisture. It was open to a chapter on ecosystems. There was a bright, colorful drawing of a bee pollinating an apple blossom, with cheerful arrows showing the transfer of pollen, the creation of a seed, the growth of a fruit. And under it, a simple caption, a partnership essential for life. I sat there in the fading light, in the absolute, buzzing silence of the dead world, and I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of profound, irreversible loss. We had broken the partnership, and now we were learning to live in the world we had made. Alone. After weeks of moving, of eating bitter greens and starchy roots, my body was sending me clear, undeniable signals. I was losing weight at an alarming rate. My scientific mind knew the equation. I was expending far more calories than I was consuming. It was an unsustainable model, a slow, walking death. I needed a calorie-dense food source, something with fats and complex carbohydrates. I needed to do more than just forage. I needed to grow something. I found my chance by accident, a small private nursery, tucked away in a valley, forgotten by the main roads. The owner had clearly specialized in organic vegetables, the wooden sign swinging on one hinge read, "Bloom and Branch," a sad piece of irony in a fruitless world. The place was overgrown, a riot of weeds, but the infrastructure was there. A large commercial-grade greenhouse stood at its center, its glass panes miraculously, impossibly intact. It was a sanctuary. Inside was a graveyard of potential. Rows of dead tomato plants, their withered brown vines clinging to support strings. Bags of sterile potting soil stacked neatly. A rainwater collection system, its barrels full. And in a forgotten corner, a single magnificent squash plant. It must have been a winter variety, a hardy cultivar that had somehow survived the neglect and sprouted from a leftover seed. It was thriving in the humid warmth of the greenhouse, its huge green leaves soaking up the sun through the dusty glass. And it was covered in bright yellow trumpet-shaped flowers, male flowers and female flowers, a perfect, self-contained opportunity for life. But without pollinators, the flowers were useless gestures. They would open, offer their pollen to an empty room, and die by evening. This, I knew, was a problem I could solve. It was not a problem of biology, not anymore. It was a problem of mechanics. My life for the next month became a ritual of meticulous, quiet work. I made the greenhouse my fortress. I barricaded the single door with heavy potting benches and covered the most exposed glass panes with old tarps to reduce my visibility. My days were governed by the delicate life cycle of the squash blossoms. They open in the early morning and are only viable for a single day. So every morning, at first light, as the greenhouse began to glow, I would become a bee. I found a child's watercolor set in the abandoned office. The finest brush, a delicate thing of soft camel hair, became the most important tool I possessed. First, I would go to the male flowers. They are simple, elegant structures, just a stalk in the center, the anther covered in a fine, golden, almost greasy dust of pollen. I would gently dip the tip of the brush, coating it in the life-giving dust. Then I would move to a female flower. They are easy to identify. They have a tiny, embryonic squash, a little green bulb, at their base, even before they are fertilized. Inside the female blossom is the stigma, a multi-lobed sticky organ waiting for a delivery. With the focus of a surgeon, I would carefully, gently paint the pollen from the brush onto the stigma, ensuring every sticky lobe was covered to maximize the chances of fertilization. One flower after another, day after day. It was painstaking, meditative work. The silence of the greenhouse was absolute, a perfect soundproof chamber. My only companion was the sound of my own breathing and the soft whisper of the camel hair brush against the delicate petals. In that small glass house on a dying planet, I was the sole agent of fertility. I was the only thing standing between this one plant and total extinction. I learned the plant's rhythms. I learned which flowers opened first, which had the most pollen. I felt a strange, profound connection to it, a sense of partnership. While it turned sunlight and water into life, I provided the spark, the necessary bridge for reproduction. It was a microcosm of the entire planet's lost symbiosis, a quiet, desperate collaboration between a man and a vegetable. While the tiny squashes at the base of the pollinated flowers began to slowly, miraculously swell and grow, I tended to my own survival. I repaired the rainwater collection system, filtering the water through layers of sand and charcoal I made from the wood stove in the office. I started a compost pile, layering the decaying plant matter with soil to create new nutrients for the future. I was a scientist in my lab once more, and the entire greenhouse was my experiment in hope. The danger, of course, was always present, a low hum of anxiety beneath the quiet work. One afternoon, while I was inside, carefully checking the growth of a promising squash, a group of 3 men passed by on the nearby road. They were thin, wiry, with the restless, hollow eyes of the truly hungry. They saw the greenhouse. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hid behind a row of empty shelves, peering through a tiny tear in the tarp. They approached cautiously, their movements jerky and suspicious. They rattled the locked door. They walked the perimeter, their boots crunching on the gravel path. One of them cupped his hands and peered through the glass, his face just inches from mine. But the glare of the sun and the layers of grime on the pane obscured his view. They saw the dead plants outside, the signs of neglect, and after a few tense minutes that felt like an eternity, they concluded it was empty, a relic of the old world, not worth their time. They moved on down the road, their voices fading. I stayed hidden for an hour after they were gone, my body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable wave of adrenaline. It was a stark reminder. My small sanctuary was a beacon. Life attracts life, and in this new world, life was a resource to be plundered. Weeks later, my work paid off. I harvested my first squash, a beautiful deep green acorn squash, heavy in my hands. I cooked it over a small, carefully managed fire that night, the smoke channeled through a makeshift chimney. The smell alone was intoxicating, a rich, sweet, earthy aroma that filled my small shelter. The taste was a victory. The sweet, nutty, caloric density was a shock to my system, so accustomed to bitter roots and leaves. It was the most delicious thing I had ever eaten. It was the taste of survival, earned not through violence or luck, but through knowledge, patience, and a steady hand. I spent another month there, growing and harvesting, building up my strength and my supplies. I sun-dried strips of the squash until they were like sweet, chewy leather, a lightweight, durable food source for the journey ahead. But I knew I couldn't stay. The risk of discovery was too great, and my mission was not to survive in one place. It was to get the library to the vault. Before I left, I did one last thing. I saved the seeds from the best of my hand-pollinated squash. I dried them carefully and placed them in a small, sealed pouch inside the main case. They were not part of my original library, but they were now just as precious. They were the first generation of a new world. Seeds that owed their existence not to a bee, but to a man with a paintbrush and the will to live. I packed my gear, took one last look at my green sanctuary, and walked back out into the silent world, stronger and more determined than ever. My path north took me out of the rolling hills and into the great agricultural flatlands, the American Midwest. This place had once been the breadbasket of the world, a testament to humanity's command over nature, an endless, monotonous grid of industrial agriculture. Now, it was a monument to our spectacular failure, a landscape of haunted, deceptive abundance. The sheer scale of it was hard to comprehend. I walked for days beside endless fields of corn. The stalks stood tall and green, their tassels rustling in the wind, releasing clouds of yellow pollen. Corn, being a grass, is wind-pollinated. It didn't need the bees, and so it thrived, a defiant survivor in the silent world. But its success was a trap for me. The fields were fiercely guarded. I would see the signs from miles away. Crude watchtowers built on top of grain silos, the glint of a rifle scope in the sun, the smoke of communal fires. Small, organized, ruthless groups had seized control of the grain supply. They had become the new feudal lords, ruling over kingdoms of corn and wheat. I gave their territories a wide berth, sticking to the overgrown drainage ditches and sparse tree lines, feeling like a spy in a foreign land. But the truly haunting landscape, the one that will stay with me forever, was the orchards. I came upon a commercial apple orchard that stretched for miles in every direction, a perfect, man-made grid of evenly spaced trees, and every single tree was heavy with rotting fruit from the last good harvest. Billions of apples, untouched, lay on the ground, a mushy, fermenting carpet that filled the air with a sickly, sweet, boozy stench of decay. The ground squished under my boots. Clouds of fruit flies, one of the few insects to thrive in this new world, rose in buzzing, agitated clouds around me with every step. There were no birds feasting on the windfall, no deer, nothing came to eat the fallen fruit. It was as if the animal kingdom knew, on some instinctual level, that this place was a graveyard, a symbol of a broken covenant. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick with the smell of decay, a sweet, cloying reminder of what had been lost. A world of sweetness, left to rot into the earth. One evening, seeking shelter from a coming storm, I found an isolated farmhouse set back from the main road, on the edge of one of these dying orchards. It was eerily tidy, almost preserved. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was clean but empty of all food, stripped bare with a desperate efficiency. But in the master bedroom, on a nightstand beside the bed, was a small, leather-bound journal. I knew I shouldn't, that it was a violation of some unspoken law, a trespass on a private grief. But I couldn't resist. I lit a candle stub I had saved, and in its flickering light I began to read. I want to read some of it to you, so you understand how it felt for them. The first entry was from the spring. The handwriting was neat, hopeful. April 12th. John says not to worry. The bees are just late this year. The trees are in full bloom, prettiest I've ever seen them. Little Sarah made a crown out of the blossoms and called herself the Queen of Spring. A week later, April 20th, still no bees. John spent all day on the phone with the co-op. Everyone's saying the same thing. It's quiet, too quiet. I saw Eleanor Gable down the road, just standing in her garden, staring at her bean flowers, crying without making a sound. Then the tone begins to shift, the neat script growing a little more hurried. June 1st. The grocery store is a nightmare. Fights in the aisles over the last bags of rice. We're okay for now. The cellar is full from last year's canning. We've got the grain, the potatoes. We'll be fine. John says we just have to be smart. He's been cleaning the guns. July 15th. The power's been off for a week solid. We listen to the emergency radio at night, but the voices are sounding tired. They talk about things I don't want to write down. John has been teaching me how to shoot the rifle. I hate the sound it makes. It feels like punching a hole in the quiet. September 3rd. A family came by today, in a big fancy car. They were thin. They offered to trade the car for a single bushel of apples. A whole car. John sent them away. He stood by the door with the shotgun all night. He didn't think I saw him crying later, out by the barn. The last entry was short. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged. October 11th. Sarah keeps asking why she can't have an apple. The trees are full of them. They're right there, red and perfect, but John says they're for seed. They're for next year. He says we have to have hope for next year. I look at all the rotting fruit on the ground, and I don't feel any hope. I just feel the rot. That was it. The rest of the pages were blank. I don't know what happened to them. Maybe they left. Maybe someone came for their cellar full of food. Maybe they simply gave up. I sat there in the dark, the candle flickering, and I felt the immense weight of their story, of all the countless stories that ended in silence. I left the journal on the nightstand. It didn't belong to me. The next day, I had my first close encounter with the new predators of this land. I was cutting across a field, moving towards a distant line of trees, when I heard the low growl of an engine. I dropped flat in the tall, dry grass, my heart seizing in my chest. Over a rise came a heavily modified pickup truck, with crude steel plates welded to its sides and roof. In the open back, 3 men stood with rifles, their faces hard and sunburnt. They weren't scavengers. They were a patrol. They were sweeping the area, methodically, professionally. They stopped near the farmhouse I had just left. 2 of them got out and went inside, moving with a practiced, predatory ease, while the driver scanned the surrounding fields with binoculars. I pressed my face into the dirt, trying to control my breathing, trying to will myself invisible. They emerged from the house a few minutes later, empty-handed. They got back in the truck and drove off, their engine noise a hateful drone that slowly faded into the distance. They were part of one of the grain factions, I was sure of it. They weren't just protecting their silo, they were expanding, absorbing the smaller homesteads, eliminating competition. This wasn't just survival anymore, it was conquest. A new form of government, born from a stalk of corn. I realized then, with chilling certainty, that the apocalypse wasn't a single event. It was a cascade. The biological collapse had triggered a societal collapse, which was now triggering a new, brutal kind of civilization to crawl from the ruins. I had to be smarter, more careful. I was no longer just a ghost. I was a trespasser in a land ruled by new, hungry kings. And all I had to protect me was my knowledge, and a case full of priceless seeds on my back. The vast, open plains of the farmlands had become a death trap. The sight lines were too long, the cover too sparse. I was too exposed to the patrols of the grain lords. I needed a new path, a different kind of highway, one that didn't show up on their maps. I spent an evening studying my own paper maps, salvaged from a gas station kiosk in the early days. All the roads led to cities, to choke points, to danger. But there was another network, a blue, branching network that snaked across the entire continent. The rivers. My logic was simple. A major river would eventually lead to a larger one, and that would eventually lead to the sea. It was a natural, undeniable path carved by gravity itself. But it was a double-edged sword. Water is life, and in this new world, wherever there was a chance at life, there were people. And wherever there were people, there was danger. I chose a tributary that looked small and insignificant on the map and headed towards it, hoping it would be less traveled. The river was a lifeline and a sewer. The water itself was a murky soup of agricultural runoff and upstream contamination, undrinkable without rigorous boiling and filtering. But its banks were a treasure trove of information, a history book of the collapse. I found abandoned campsites littered with clues about those who had passed before me. A pile of meticulously cleaned fish bones told me what species were still biting and what kind of trap worked. A tattered book on celestial navigation told me others had the same idea as me, to take to the water. And the bodies, I found bodies too. Washed up in log jams, tangled in reeds, a stark, constant reminder that the river was not a gentle guide. It was as indifferent as the rest of this new world. I followed its winding path for weeks, a silent pilgrim on its banks. The world here was different. The vegetation was thicker, a chaotic, untamed tangle of green. I found myself in a rhythm, a routine of walking, foraging, purifying water, and hiding, and watching, always watching. One day I saw him, a man alone on the opposite bank. He was older, with a lean, wiry frame and skin like tanned leather. He was a fisherman, but unlike any I had ever seen. He had constructed an ingenious trap, a long, funnel-like cage woven from willow branches, a weir placed strategically in a narrow channel of the river. He wasn't using a rod and reel, waiting for luck. He was harvesting, using 1,000 years of forgotten knowledge. I watched him for an entire day from a thicket of reeds, my binoculars turning me into an invisible, anthropological spectator. His movements were economical and precise. He checked his trap in the morning, pulling out a handful of small catfish and perch. He cleaned them with a sharp shard of flint, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a lifetime. He had a small smokehouse made of mud and sticks where he hung the fish to cure. He wasted nothing. He was completely in tune with his environment. He wasn't just surviving, he was living in his own quiet, ordered, sustainable world. I never made contact, I never called out. What was there to say? We were two different species of survivor. He was a homesteader, a native of this new world. I was a traveler, a courier, a ghost from the old one. I felt a profound sense of respect for him. He was proof that a person could adapt, could find a new, smaller symbiosis. But his path was not my path. I was not meant to stay. I was meant to keep moving. I left him to his quiet kingdom and continued my journey downstream. My own great test came a few days later. The tributary I was following merged with a much larger, wider river, a brown, churning expanse of water I couldn't possibly cross on foot. My map told me there was a bridge 20 miles north, but a bridge was a guaranteed choke point, a place to be controlled and fought over. I had to get across here. I needed a raft. This was a problem of engineering, not biology. But the principles were the same: structure, buoyancy, integrity. I spent a full day scavenging along the riverbank, which was littered with the detritus of our industrial civilization. I found a large, thick vinyl tarp from the wreckage of a central, waterproof and incredibly durable. I found a stand of dead, dry ash trees near the bank, their wood lightweight but strong. The hardest part was cordage. I needed rope, something strong enough to hold the logs together against the powerful current. I found it in the most unlikely of places, the tires of an abandoned tractor half sunk in the mud. I spent the better part of a day, my hands raw and bleeding, using my knife and a pry bar from the truck to strip the steel-belted radials from within the thick rubber. Then, painstakingly, I braided the thin, strong wires into crude but effective ropes. I built the raft over 2 days, lashing the ash logs together with my wire rope, and then wrapping the entire platform with a heavy tarp, creating a buoyant, stable platform. It was ugly, clumsy, a Frankenstein's monster of a vessel, but I calculated it would hold my weight and my precious gear. The launch was the most dangerous part. I had to do it in a spot with good cover, where the current wasn't too strong. I waited for the gray, misty light of dawn and pushed my clumsy creation into the water. The current caught it immediately, pulling it away from the shore with frightening speed. I scrambled on, my heart in my throat, using a long, sturdy branch as a pole to steer. I was completely exposed, a tiny, slow-moving speck on a vast, indifferent river. Every ripple seemed like a threat, every floating log a potential disaster. The far bank seemed miles away. It was a terrifying, exhilarating half-hour. My arms ached, my knuckles were white against the pole, but I kept my focus, poling, guiding, fighting the relentless current. When the raft finally scraped against the muddy bank of the far shore, I lay on it for a long time, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. I had crossed. I looked back at the wide expanse of water. It was a barrier I had overcome, a test I had passed. I was a botanist. I was not an engineer or a sailor or an adventurer, but I was learning. This new world was forcing me to evolve or die. I pulled my precious seed case onto the shore, shouldered my pack, and disappeared into the dense trees on the other side, leaving my makeshift raft to be reclaimed by the river. The river eventually broadened, the banks becoming cluttered with the ghosts of industry. Abandoned factories, their windows like broken teeth, rusting barges half sunk in the murky water, the skeletal remains of docks and cranes. I could smell the city before I could see it. A complex, layered scent of stagnant water, of cold, damp concrete, and a faint underlying sweetish odor of decay that clung to the air. I had reached a port city, my gateway to the sea. Cities were the epicenters of the collapse. They were wholly dependent organisms, vast concrete parasites unable to survive without the constant transfusion of resources, food, water, power, from the outside world. When the trucks and trains and ships stopped, they began to starve, and they turned on themselves. The chaos here had been faster, more brutal, more concentrated than in the countryside. The city was a vertical desert. Everything of obvious value had been scavenged long ago. The ground floors of every building were hollowed-out shells, their windows like vacant eyes. I had to learn a new kind of foraging. I would look for the things people had overlooked in their initial frantic panic for food and water. In the basement of a ruined, flooded bookstore, I found a cache of high-protein energy bars, forgotten in a stockroom manager's locker. In a sporting goods store, its front window shattered, I found a durable, waterproof duffel bag and a hand-crank emergency radio. In a world of scarcity, these were treasures beyond price. But the city was not empty. It was a patchwork of territories, a feudal map of fear. I learned to read the graffiti, the new language of the urban ruin. A spray-painted wolf's head meant the territory of the Hounds, a vicious gang that controlled the old meatpacking district. A stylized, weeping sunburst belonged to the Children of Light, a quasi-religious cult that believed the apocalypse was a divine cleansing and that technology was a sin. Their borders were not suggestions, they were deadlines. Crossing one without permission was a death sentence. I moved like a rat in the walls, using the dark, silent service tunnels beneath the streets, the precarious fire escapes on the sides of buildings, and the skeletal remains of the elevated train lines that crisscrossed the downtown core. My life was measured in shadows and silence. The city had its own soundscape, the constant, mournful whistle of the wind through shattered skyscrapers, the distant, startling crash of falling glass, the sudden, terrifying crack of a gunshot echoing and re-echoing through the concrete canyons. One day, trapped on a rooftop by a passing hounds patrol, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. They weren't just scavenging, they were farming. On the wide, flat gravel and tar roof of a massive department store, they had laid out thousands of plastic kiddie pools, salvaged from some forgotten toy store, filled them with soil they had laboriously hauled up from the city parks, and were growing potatoes. It was organized, it was systematic. They were laying down roots, creating a permanent, brutal city-state. They were the opposite of everything I was trying to achieve. They were hoarding life for themselves, creating a fiefdom of scarcity. I was trying to carry life back out into the world for everyone. My sanctuary in this concrete hell was the city's central library. It was a magnificent old building of marble and stone, a temple to knowledge, and it had been largely ignored by the scavengers. What use are books in a world of empty stomachs? To me, it was an arsenal. The grand front doors had been breached, but the interior was a quiet, dusty heaven. I found a small, windowless office in the sub-basement, once used for archiving, and made it my base of operations. For 2 weeks, I became a scholar of survival. I found the nautical section, a treasure trove. I found detailed charts of the North Atlantic. I found books on celestial navigation, on small diesel engine repair, on the theory of sailing. I sat in the dusty silence, under the narrow beam of my hand-crank flashlight, and I studied. I cross-referenced the charts with my paper maps. I memorized constellations and their paths through the night sky. I learned the difference between a jib and a mainsail, a cleat and a bollard, a spring line and a breast line. My botany knowledge was useless here. I had to learn the science of the sea. The library was also full of the stories of the city's fall. People had used it as a message board in the final, desperate days. They had scrawled notes on the walls, on the old paper checkout cards, on the fly leaves of books. Maria, if you read this, I'm going to the old shelter at St. Michael's Church. Will wait for you as long as I can. Leo. To whoever finds this, the water in the cistern on the roof of the Meridian building is not safe. We learned the hard way. Don't make our mistake. God has forsaken us. The sun is a lie. The silence is his true voice. It was a city of ghosts, their last words written in dust and despair. I was an intruder in their tomb, but their warnings, their collective, fragmented knowledge, saved my life more than once. They taught me which areas were permanently flooded, which gangs were the most violent, which routes through the city were the safest. My time in the library hardened my resolve. The city was a trap. It was an echo of the old way of life, a complex machine that had run out of fuel. It consumed everything and produced nothing. The future was not in these concrete canyons. It was out there, on the open water and beyond. I packed my new knowledge into my head, my salvaged supplies into my new waterproof bag, and prepared to face the final leg of my landward journey, the harbor. I had to leave the world of stone and enter the world of salt and steel. The harbor was the edge of the world. It was a place of sleeping, iron giants. Massive container ships, once the tireless lifeblood of global commerce, now sat listing in the murky water, their hulls painted with the intricate, beautiful patterns of rust. The skeletons of gantry cranes clawed at the sky like skeletal dinosaurs, their cables swinging and groaning in the wind. The air was thick with a unique perfume of decay. The sharp tang of salt, the faint, greasy smell of old diesel, and the low-tide stench of rot. The silence here was different, punctuated by the mournful groaning of stressed metal and the lonely, mocking cry of seagulls, the one bird that seemed to thrive in this dead world. This was the final and most daunting challenge of my journey so far. I needed a boat. Not just any boat, but a vessel capable of surviving the unforgiving crossing of the North Atlantic. My search was methodical, a process of elimination driven by the knowledge I had crammed into my head in the library. I moved through the marinas and commercial docks like a surveyor, my eyes scanning for potential. Most of the small pleasure craft were useless, their fiberglass hulls cracked and brittle from the sun, their engines long since stripped for parts. The massive container ships were equally impossible, requiring a full crew and a small power station just to start their engines. I needed something in the middle, something sturdy, simple, and self-sufficient. I found her in a forgotten corner of a private marina, covered in a green, moldy tarp, bobbing gently between two larger, sinking yachts. She was a sailboat, a 30-foot cutter rig, her hull made of thick, solid steel. Her name was painted on the transom in faded blue letters that had somehow survived the neglect, the Wanderer. She was perfect. Steel hulls were durable, forgiving, repairable in a way fiberglass was not. Her sails, bundled on the boom, were old but appeared mostly intact. And her simple, auxiliary diesel engine was a model I had just spent a week studying in a textbook. But she was not ready. Her decks were littered with debris. Her cabin was flooded with a foot of foul-smelling black rainwater. And, as I discovered after a full day of pumping and cleaning, her engine was missing a crucial, central component, the fuel injector pump. A complex, precision-engineered piece of machinery that meters fuel to the cylinders. It was something I could never hope to build myself. The task felt insurmountable. I sat on the damp deck of the Wanderer, the scale of my ignorance pressing down on me. I was a botanist. I could coax life from a seed, but I couldn't resurrect a dead engine. For the first time in a long time, my scientific certainty, my belief that any problem could be solved with enough data and logic, failed me. And in that moment of despair, a flicker of a memory surfaced, unbidden. My father, a man who could fix anything, trying to teach me how to change the oil in our family car when I was a teenager. I had been impatient, dismissive. I had a biology test to study for. I had told him I didn't have time for greasy mechanical things. I remembered the look of quiet disappointment on his face. He had just shaken his head and said, "Kenji, a smart man knows how things work. All things." The memory was a spur, a painful one. My father was gone. His world was gone. But his words remained. I couldn't let a piece of machinery defeat me. I had to learn. I had to adapt. I would find the part. My search led me to the industrial heart of the port. I had heard whispers in the library's ghost writings, seen signs of a functioning community in this area. Not a gang, but something else. They called themselves the dockhands, former engineers, mechanics, welders, and longshoremen who had turned the port's main shipping terminal into a fortified, self-sufficient enclave. They had a workshop. They had power, scavenged from the vast solar panel arrays on the warehouse roofs, and they had a system of trade. Approaching them was a risk. I was an outsider, but I knew I had something to offer. Not goods, not a scavenged trinket, but knowledge. My kind of knowledge. I spent a day observing their compound from a distance. I saw their strength, their high walls, their organized patrols, their functioning machinery. But I also saw their weakness. Their diet was monotonous. I saw them fishing, and I saw them hauling crates of old canned goods. They had no green things, no fresh food. I made my approach openly, unarmed, my hands in the air. I carried a small bag with me. I was met at their gate by two grim-faced people carrying weapons made from sharpened rebar and boat hooks. They said nothing. They just watched me with cold, appraising eyes. I didn't speak. I simply knelt down on the grimy asphalt, opened my bag, and got to work. I had brought samples with me on the journey from the inland marshes. I took out a handful of salicornia, or sea asparagus, a salt-tolerant succulent I had found growing in abundance near the harbor. I took out a bag of dried kelp. In a cleared patch of ground near their gate, I began to demonstrate. I showed them how to prepare the salicornia, blanching it quickly to remove some of the saltiness. I showed them how to soak and cook the kelp, releasing its nutrients and umami flavor. I used a salvaged piece of sheet metal and some driftwood to construct a simple solar still, showing them how to desalinate seawater to get fresh water, not just for drinking, but for growing terrestrial plants in a protected environment. I worked for hours. They watched in silence. When I was done, I stood up and looked at them. Their leader, a tall woman with grease-stained hands and piercingly intelligent eyes, stepped forward. She looked at my small, improvised garden, then back at me. She gave me a slow, single nod. She understood. I had offered them a new branch of survival. She led me to their workshop. It was an engineer's paradise, filled with lathes, welding equipment, and neatly organized drawers of salvaged parts. I drew a diagram of the fuel injector pump from memory, my library studies paying off. I specified the model, the number of cylinders, the approximate size. She looked at my drawing, then went to a large metal cabinet and, after a few moments of searching, pulled one out. It was not a perfect match, but it was close. Close enough. The trade was complete. No money, no haggling, just a silent, respectful transaction of pure expertise. I walked back to the Wanderer, my new, heavy piece of metal feeling like a sacred object. It took me another week of painstaking work in the cramped, oily engine compartment, my knuckles raw, my body aching in protest. I followed the diagrams in the textbook, my hands slowly, clumsily learning the language of mechanics. And then, the moment of truth. I bled the fuel lines, primed the engine, took a deep breath and turned the key. There was a cough, a sputter of protest. And then a miracle. The low, rhythmic, beautiful thrum of a functioning diesel engine filled the silence. It was the sound of a future, the sound of the open sea. I had done it. I had learned how things work. Leaving the shore was a profound rebirth. The moment the Wanderer's steel hull broke free from the grimy, stagnant waters of the harbor and met the clean, deep swell of the open ocean, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. The land, with its factions, its decay, its constant close quarters threat, was behind me. Ahead lay a new adversary, one that was far larger and more powerful, but also simpler, cleaner. The ocean didn't hate me. It didn't want my seeds. It was simply there, a vast, beautiful, and completely indifferent wilderness. The audio of my life changed completely. The skittering sounds of the city, the distant gunshots, the mournful wind, the crunch of glass were replaced by the symphony of the sea. The constant, reassuring creak of the boat's rigging as it took the strain of the wind, the rhythmic slap of waves against the steel hull, a heartbeat for my journey. The sharp, lonely cry of a soaring albatross, my only companion for days on end. For the first time in over a year, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet joy, even amidst the immense, undeniable danger. I was utterly, completely alone. My only companions were the sun, the moon, and the stars. At night, with no light pollution anywhere on the planet to obscure the view, the cosmos was a terrifying, brilliant spectacle. The Milky Way wasn't a faint smudge. It was a brilliant, shimmering slash across a velvet black sky, so bright it felt like you could reach out and touch it. I had my salvaged charts and a simple plastic sextant I'd found on a derelict yacht, and I began the ancient, intricate dance of celestial navigation. I would spend hours at dusk and dawn, when the horizon was still visible, measuring the angle of Polaris or the sun above the water, performing the calculations with pencil and paper, and making a small, neat X on my chart. Each mark was a victory, a confirmation that I was not lost, that I was still on course, a tiny speck of intention moving across a vast, empty canvas. Survival on the ocean was a relentless, cleansing routine. I collected rainwater in a tarp I rigged on the deck, funneling it into my fresh water tanks. I fished. My greatest success was a large tuna, a battle of endurance that left my arms and back screaming with effort for days, but which provided me with weeks of food. I sliced the dark red meat into thin strips and hung them from the rigging to dry in the sun and wind, creating a salty, protein-rich jerky that tasted of the clean sea itself. The ocean was not always peaceful. I was hit by a storm a few weeks out, a multi-day gale that turned the world into a chaos of shrieking wind and mountainous gray waves. I reefed the sails down to their smallest possible size and spent 48 hours tied into the cockpit, soaked and freezing, my hands raw from gripping the tiller, fighting to keep the boat's nose pointed into the colossal waves. The Wanderer was a magnificent vessel. She was not fast or elegant, but she was strong. She rose and fell with the waves with a stubborn grace, her steel hull groaning and shuddering but holding firm. In the heart of that storm, tossed about by forces I couldn't possibly comprehend, I felt a deep primal fear, but also a strange exhilaration. I was a tiny, insignificant speck of life, pitted against the full fury of the planet, and I was holding my own. It was during the long, calm days after the storm, as I repaired a torn sail with my clumsy stitches, that I allowed myself time to truly think, to speak into this recorder, not just as a chronicler of my journey, but as a scientist, to articulate the core of my mission. Why was this journey so important? Why Svalbard? It's about the bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck. It's a term we use in evolutionary biology. When a species' population is drastically reduced, its genetic diversity is squeezed through that tiny opening. The few survivors carry only a small fraction of the original gene pool. The world of agriculture, the foundation of human civilization, was now facing the most extreme bottleneck in history. The thousands of varieties of apples, of peaches, of plums, of almonds, of all the countless foods that relied on pollinators, they were functionally extinct. Their genetic lines were broken forever. Gone. What remained was what could survive without the partnership. The grains, the self-pollinating legumes, a few stubborn vegetables. But to rebuild a world on that alone would be to live in a perpetual state of nutritional deficiency. It would be a gray, monotonous diet, lacking the vital micronutrients, the vitamins, the variety that a healthy, resilient human population needs to thrive. It would be a world without flavor, without joy, without the complex chemistry that makes us human. Svalbard. Svalbard holds the backups. It holds the key to unlocking that diversity again, but in a new way. Inside that vault are the genetic codes for tens of thousands of cultivars. We could, in time, with the science that could be reborn in a generation or two, identify the genes for self-pollination in one species, and using advanced genetic engineering, introduce them into another. We could create self-pollinating almonds. We could design strawberries that don't need a bee. It wouldn't be the same world. It wouldn't be the natural world our ancestors knew. It would be an engineered one. A garden tended by the careful, deliberate hand of science. It's a distant hope, a project for our grandchildren or their grandchildren. But my task, my simple, mechanical task, is to get the library books back on the shelf. That's all. I am just the courier, carrying a message of hope to a future I will never see. The first iceberg was a ghost on the horizon, a pale blue phantom in the morning mist. I had sailed north, far north, into the cold, clear waters of the Greenland Sea. The air was different here. It was clean, crisp, and so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. The water was a deep, impossible blue. I saw whales, great pods of them, their massive bodies breaching the surface with a casual power that was humbling. They were a reminder that the ocean, at least, was still alive, its own vast, complex ecosystem, largely intact and indifferent to the silence on land. I wrapped myself in every layer of clothing I owned. The days grew shorter, the sun a low, weak disk on the horizon even at noon. The nights became longer and colder. I was sailing towards the pole, towards the darkness. My journey was nearing its end. The greatest library on Earth was waiting for me, buried under a mountain of ice at the top of the world. The final leg of the journey was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl through a maze of white and blue. The sea was no longer open, but a shifting, treacherous puzzle of ice floes and growlers, smaller, nearly submerged chunks of ice, dense as rock, that could tear a hole in a steel hull as easily as a can opener. My engine, the one I had so painstakingly repaired, was now my lifeline. I rarely used the sails, instead motoring slowly, my eyes constantly scanning the water ahead, my hand never far from the tiller, ready to change course in an instant. The landscape was stunningly, brutally beautiful. The ice was not just white, it was 1,000 shades of blue, from pale sky to deep sapphire, sculpted by wind and water into fantastical shapes like the ruins of a crystal city. The sun, when it appeared, was a low, weak disk on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the ice fields. The silence was absolute, deeper and more profound than any silence I had experienced on land. There was no wind in the leaves, no distant hum of civilization, not even the cry of a seagull. Just the crunch and scrape of ice against the wanderer's hull and the low, reassuring thrum of my engine. I navigated using my charts and the jagged black peaks of the islands of the Svalbard archipelago, which now stood starkly against the white snow. The cold was a physical presence, a constant, aching weight that settled deep in my bones. Frost grew on my eyelashes. My breath froze in clouds before me. My dwindling supply of dried squash and fish jerky was frozen solid, and I had to chip off pieces to thaw in my mouth. Then I saw it. Through my binoculars, I scanned the side of a large, snow-covered mountain, just as the charts indicated, and there it was. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a monument. It was a simple, stark concrete wedge protruding from the mountainside, a long, narrow triangle of gray against the white like a surgical incision in the landscape. The entrance to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. After everything, after all the miles and the fear and the hunger, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I found a small sheltered cove, a natural harbor where the ice was thin, and carefully anchored the wanderer. The final journey was on foot. I packed my precious seed case, a small amount of food, and a flare gun. Stepping onto the solid land was a strange sensation after months at sea. The ground felt unnaturally still beneath my feet, the silence even more complete without the sounds of the boat. The climb up the mountain slope to the entrance was grueling. The snow was deep, and the wind was a physical blow, a solid wall of force trying to push me back. But the sight of that concrete wedge drew me forward. It was a symbol of everything I had fought for: logic, foresight, reason, hope. I reached the entrance, my body shaking with cold and exhaustion. The heavy steel door was, as I had prayed, slightly ajar, wedged open by a chunk of fallen ice. It was a silent invitation, left for people like me. I slipped inside, out of the wind, and the world went completely, utterly silent. I was in a long, concrete tunnel, lit by emergency lights set low on the walls, their green glow casting long shadows. It sloped steeply downwards, deeper and deeper into the mountain. The air grew colder, drier, the walls covered in a delicate, sparkling tracery of frost. It felt like walking into the heart of a glacier. The only sound was the crunch of my own boots on the frozen concrete. I walked for what felt like a mile, my flashlight beam cutting a small, lonely circle in the gloom. The tunnel ended at a massive, heavily insulated steel door, like the entrance to a bank vault. My heart sank. It was sealed tight, an impenetrable wall of steel and ice. For a moment, a crushing despair washed over me. Had I come all this way for nothing? To fail at the very end? But then my light caught something to the side of the main door. A small, stainless steel panel, no bigger than a microwave door. Above it, a small screen was glowing with a soft green light. It was an automated deposit system, a quarantine airlock for new samples. I stumbled towards it, my cold-numbed fingers reaching out. The screen flickered to life as I approached, motion activated. The words were in simple, blocky English, a universal language of science. Quarantine Protocol 7 in effect. System online. Power nominal. Deposit samples for analysis and storage. Log your biometric signature for archival record. Welcome, survivor. A low hum and a small drawer slid open from the panel with a pneumatic hiss. Inside was a sterile, climate-controlled compartment, glowing with a soft, internal light. I nearly wept. I fell to my knees, my laughter echoing strangely in the frozen tunnel. It wasn't a community. It wasn't a warm welcome from other survivors. It was something better. It was a system. A cold, logical, beautifully rational system, left running by people who had looked ahead and planned for the worst. A quiet, automated promise that our work, our knowledge, would not be lost. I took the case from my back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. I opened it. Inside, nestled in their protective foam, were the small labeled packets of seeds. The peas, the beans, the wheat, the corn, and the small packet of squash seeds I had saved from my own hand-pollinated harvest in the greenhouse. My children. My proof that we could learn. One by one I placed the packets into the deposit hatch. Each one was a lifetime of food, a field, a harvest, a future. When the case was empty, I placed my hand on the biometric scanner below the screen, as instructed. There was a soft chime, and new words appeared on the screen, logging my existence into the vault's archive. Logged in identif Homo sapiens, entry 001. I was the first. The hatch slid shut with a solid, reassuring thud. A series of lights on the panel blinked from red to green. I had done it. My delivery was complete. The seeds were safe. They were home. I don't know what I will do now. Perhaps I will see if the Wanderer can take me south again to a warmer climate. Perhaps I will try to live here in this cold, clean world. It doesn't matter. My mission is accomplished. The library is open, and someday someone will come to check out the books. This is Kenji Tanaka, signing off. Thanks for tuning in. If this narrative pulled you into its depths, consider giving the video a like. Your support is how these stories get told. And if you're ready for more chilling, plausible adventures, make sure you subscribe and join our growing community of explorers. What will we uncover next?